And the guy was, what? He said, no, he said, when it's you, him, and it's all.
What's my favourite cinema too?
Okay. Good evening. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Astor Theatre. Thank you all for coming out tonight. It's a bit chilly and windy out there, but I think we've got a nice evening for you, and The Right Stuff is truly a great film to see. My name is Peter Aylward. I'm from the Space Association of Australia. And I'm going to wait for the slide. And as you may or may not know, today, or this week, is the 40th anniversary of the mission of Apollo 11, the mission to land the first humans on another world. And that took place back in 1969, 40 years ago. So tonight, what we're going to do is to give you a little overview of what the world was like in 1969, what happened on that mission, and a little bit of the lead up to how it came about, and something maybe of relevant interest to Australia's unique role and important role in that mission success. And we also have a very special guest with us, someone who was actually there at the launch of the Apollo 11 spacecraft to the moon back in 1969. So with that, I'm going to take the microphone over. So on screen you can see a newspaper, the Sun, back in 1969, the day after the landing. I cut this out with my scissors when I was very young. The Sun was 5 cents back then, and it probably brings back memories. What I'd like to do to give a bit of context to how the moon landing mission came about is to talk about the lead up to that. And back in the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, in the Second World War, America, England, Russia, Soviet Union were allies against the Germans. And very soon after the end of the war, or even before the end of the war, there was territory being fought over and negotiated who was going to get control of parts of Europe and Asia. And this developed into what became the Cold War. At the end of the Second World War, America had developed the nuclear bomb and dropped that on Japan. Very soon after the end of that, the Soviet Union, in fact, developed the nuclear weapon. And it was widely believed in the West that the Soviet Union had expansion plans, wanted to move into western parts of Europe. The map up there shows post-war Europe. All the red side is the Soviet bloc, and the other parts are the Western bloc. In fact, they divided Germany in half, and that only came down back in the start of at the end of the beginning of the 90s. Having both sides of this Cold War nuclear armed meant that they could inflict severe destruction on each other. But how would you deliver those weapons? Well, both countries, especially the Soviet Union, were actively involved in developing rockets to be able to put those warheads onto those rockets and drop them anywhere in the world. And America had a program, but they kind of were going along with it. There was a little operation down in Huntsville. They'd had some German scientists that they'd captured. The Russians had their own German scientists that they captured, because during the latter parts of the Second World War, the Nazis had developed rockets and were dropping them on England. So the American Germans were developing and working on their rockets, and the Soviet ones had significant investment, and they developed a set of rockets and shocked the world by actually orbiting a spacecraft back in 1957 called Sputnik 1. And this sent shockwaves around the world, and in some cases inspired people. Shockwaves because all of a sudden in America, in England, in Europe, the Soviet Union were orbiting a spacecraft above their territory and theoretically being able to drop a bomb or something from space. And this caused a lot of shock and a lot of angst amongst the Western countries. Newspapers around the world flashed these headlines, and as I say, some people were inspired by this, others were very frightened and scared. One of the German scientists that was captured at the end of the Second World War was Werner von Braun, and he was a German scientist, brilliant engineer, but also a great communicator and a great inspirator. And he worked during the 50s to actively promote space flight. He was a big advocate of manned space flight, a big advocate of pushing the boundaries, pushing imagination of people to try and get people into space. And he was a big advocate of people going into space. Once again, out of the blue, the world was shocked by the orbiting of the first human in space, once again by the Soviet Union. And this really put the shockwaves up the America especially, and the Western powers. They were falling behind. Why weren't we in space? What's going on with our people? We should be the leaders of the technology in the world. America was in fact working on a space program, and various delays. They were working on a manned rocket testing, trying to get things sorted out correctly. A lot of explosions, a lot of disasters, a lot of problems. No one was killed, but they had a lot of teething problems to try and get the missions up. Eventually they did. In 1961, Alan Shepard, a 15-minute flight. He didn't actually go into orbit. He just went up flew in space for a few minutes and then came back down again, but he was hailed as a hero. America was back. The unique part about it was that in the American case, they broadcast the mission live on television. In the case of the Soviet Union, the Gagarin flight, this was all announced after the mission, or while the mission had successfully launched. Once again, Wernher von Braun saw his chance to push his ambitions. He wanted to go to the moon, he wanted people to go to the moon. So he actively campaigned within the administration, within the public, within the media, to talk about going to the moon, to having a moon mission, to set the standard, to advance technology, to prove to the world that the Western democracies were in fact the leaders and could be supreme in the world. And he, once again, was a great advocate of manned spaceflight. Very shortly after Alan Shepard's flight, John F. Kennedy, with his advisors, decided the way to galvanise the country, to turn around this perceived lack of progress in their technology, was to set a very ambitious goal, to land a man on the moon and return him safely to the Earth by the end of the decade. So this set in place a massive investment of technology, of people, of ideas, of engineering. And they pursued actively their Mercury space program, which is a one-man spacecraft. After Alan Shepard and Gus Grissom's flight, eventually they got John Glenn into orbit, and he was an absolute hero in America. And throughout the Mercury program, they were developing and understanding the spacecraft technologies, the ability for environmental control, and the ability to track and support people in space. Following that, they moved on to the Gemini program, which was designed with 2 astronauts to be able to actually change the orbital path, to be able to rendezvous, change their height, attach to other spacecraft, to learn how to do spacewalks, all the things that would be required to do a mission to the moon. Project Apollo was the successor to the Gemini program, and this was the program to land people on the moon. And because the end of the decade was approaching very quickly, there was all stops pulled, and in fact, they cut corners and made mistakes. And this resulted in the death of 3 astronauts. Now, they weren't in space, they were actually on the launch pad at Cape Kennedy. They were doing what they call a plugs-out test, testing the spacecraft, fully powered, fully fueled, and a fire within the spacecraft killed all astronauts virtually instantly. This caused a halt to the program, and they had to re-engineer. They had to study what was the problem with the spacecraft, why this had happened. They uncovered many, many flaws in the design and cutting corners in wiring and materials used in the spacecraft, etc. In fact, many say that without this fire, because the fire was fortunate in a way that it happened on the ground, because they were able to study what happened, they were able to pull the spacecraft apart and determine what mistakes were made and correct them. The Apollo program picked up, and eventually, after a number of test flights of the Saturn V vehicle, the largest rocket ever to be built, they were finally ready in 1969 to be able to launch the first landing attempt. And many people felt that the landing attempt, as it was known, was really going to be an attempt. There was probably a 50-50 chance that it would be successful, including the astronauts on the crew itself. Whether any number of problems could arise and it would cause them to scrub that mission or abort and come back. So we had Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin nominated as the crew. So finally launch day came, July 1969, and the crew departed for the launch pad. They made their preparations. They were sealed into the capsule. This capsule was 363 feet, I'm sorry, I don't know the metric conversion, above the ground. It was a huge rocket, the largest ever built. And they were sealed in there. All of the crew, all of the press, all of the people involved, other than the crew, were 3 miles at least away from the rocket, because if it blew up, it would be a huge explosion. The astronauts themselves had an emergency escape bunker, which was actually below the launch pad, and a rubber room with springs which they could escape to. Once again, all the checks were made and they were finally ready. And in Australia, on Monday, July 16th, 1969, 11:32 I believe it was in Australia, the mission to the moon to land the first people on the moon took off. And we have some TV which should start momentarily. This was how it looked, not in Australia because we didn't have colour television in Australia.
20 seconds and counting. T-minus 15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence starts. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11. Tower cleared.
We got a roll program.
Neil Armstrong reporting the roll and pitch program, which puts Apollo 11 on a proper heading. Plus 30 seconds.
Roll complete and pitches program.
Altitude's 2 miles.
Oh, 11 Houston, you're good at 1 minute.
Downrange 1 mile, altitude 4 miles now. Velocity 2,195 feet per second.
And so they were off, and they entered the orbit around the Earth after losing all their stages and getting to orbital speed. All of the spacecraft materials were aboard and they were ready to go off to the moon, firing the engine a second time, this time performing the trans-lunar injection, shooting them away from the Earth. The lunar module all this time was tucked in a special container behind the command module where the astronauts were. The lunar module is a pure spacecraft. It's not aerodynamic, it's not designed to fly in air. It's only designed to fly in space. So they separated from the carrier stage, turned around, connected to the lunar module, extracted the lunar module, and then they were off on the way to the moon. Now that was a 4-day trip to the moon. And on their way, because of the extreme temperatures experienced in space, where you have plus 250 degrees in the sun and minus 250 degrees in the shade, they performed what they call a barbecue roll, where they rotated the spacecraft every 2 or 3 minutes, just on very slow rotation, so that no side would freeze and no side would heat up. Finally, after 4 days, they entered the orbit of the moon. Once Armstrong and Aldrin had moved into the lunar module, they'd made all their checks and then separated from the command module. Michael Collins remained in orbit around the moon. They fired their braking engine to come down for a landing on the surface of the moon. And that took place at 6:17 in the morning here in Australia on the 21st of July. A couple of hours later, Neil Armstrong was ready to make his first steps.
Footpads are only depressed in the surface about 1 or 2 inches, although the surface appears to be very, very fine-grained as you get close to it. It's almost like a powder. Ground mass is very fine. step off the lamb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
And there it was, stepping onto the moon. Actually, Neil Armstrong commented that he felt that the landing on the moon was the most significant achievement. Actually, getting out and walking on the moon was, he felt, not a highlight at all. The landing was the great achievement. So the astronauts, Buzz Aldrin followed shortly thereafter, stepped onto the moon and spent a couple of hours, about 2.5 hours, setting up experiments, taking pictures. In fact, most of the pictures that you see, like this one, are in fact of Buzz Aldrin. And Neil Armstrong had the camera most of the time, and so all the pictures you see are primarily of Buzz Aldrin. After a short rest and getting back inside the spacecraft and a short rest, packing all their samples, they were ready then to return to the Earth. Now this, many felt, was one of the most dangerous and critical times because there was a single engine to get back off the moon's surface. If that engine failed, they were there forever. And this engine was designed to be simple, easy to use, no igniter required. The fuels themselves would ignite on contact. And of course it was successful. They blasted off from the moon. And this is Michael Collins taking a picture of the ascent stage of the lunar module returning back with the Earth rising behind. They then rendezvoused in lunar orbit and docked. Once they'd moved their precious cargo of rocks, and the astronauts, of course, made sure all the checks and everything was correct, they then separated from the lunar module, and that remained in orbit, and I believe crashed on the moon later on. And they used it actually as an experiment to test their experiments they left on the moon. They fired their engine to go back to the Earth. Once again, 4 days travel back to the Earth, and upon getting close to the Earth itself, the service module, which had been supplying them fuel and life support for the entire trip back, was no longer used. They separated and commenced the re-entry back into the atmosphere. And the re-entry speed was around about 25,000 miles per hour, and the temperature on the spacecraft was around about that of the sun. Following successful parachute deployment, they landed back on the Earth safely at 2:50 in the morning Australian time. And they were put into biological isolation because they weren't sure whether there were biological bugs on the moon, so they remained in suits until they got into a special trailer that sealed them away from the rest of the world. Now, the television you saw was quite unique, and in fact, Neil Armstrong commented that he was amazed that the television at all was achieved, let alone the quality, which has been a lot of discussion of lately. Australia played a critical role in getting that television to the world. The primary TV pictures came through from Honeysuckle Creek in New South Wales, and then went off to Sydney to an exchange there, broadcast off to the US. And in fact, Australia saw some of the best quality TV because we actually took a direct feed rather than going to the US and back out again. So the live pictures, the first live pictures were through Honeysuckle Creek, and this is the type of technology that was used back then. And then shortly thereafter, about 6 minutes later, the television pictures through Parkes were deemed to be a better quality, and they switched over to Parkes for the remainder of the moonwalk. Now, I'd like to invite to the stage a well-known celebrity broadcaster, journalist of many years standing and experience. This man was a correspondent in the US back in the 60s and was in fact at the launch of the Apollo 11 mission, and I'd like to invite him to the stage to share his experience. Darren Hinch, everybody.
Thank you, Peter. Well, it brings back memories for me. I'm sure it does for you as well. I'll be very brief, but being at Cape Kennedy on that day was an extraordinary experience for anybody. I was about 25 years old and I was working in newspapers, but was freelancing for the Macquarie network of radio. I just started doing that as a little earner on the side, so I knew nothing about radio. Some people say I still don't. But it was an extraordinary day. We went out there about midnight the night before because 1 million people were in the area to watch all this unfold, and we thought we wouldn't get there unless we get caught in a traffic jam. So we were there from midnight. Throughout the night we were there. You saw those shots of the 3 astronauts as they walked towards their van to go out to the launch pad. And some of us in a pool were very lucky that I guess I was standing as far away from Neil Armstrong as Peter is from me now as they came out. And as he had said earlier, with the astronauts were sort of smiling and waving at everybody, and they were happy. But for all of us, I'd covered Apollo 1 as well, and that's when Grissom, Chaffee and White were killed. And it was very much in everybody's minds that this was a very dangerous business and that these men may not come back. And in fact, Richard Nixon, who was then president, had actually recorded 2 speeches for their return. And one was that if they didn't come back, he had already got a speech ready to say that these men went in peace for all mankind and they will stay forever on the moon. But obviously, as we've seen, it was an incredibly successful voyage into space. It was a magic moment. I said at the time that as long as I lived, I'd never see anything like it. Well, I've survived another 40 years, covered a lot of stories, never seen anything like it. But I'd just like you to listen just for a little bit to this. This is how you heard how Mission Control called the countdown and called the launch. This is how, on one of my early days in radio, saw it and called it.
The mission to watch. Now, right now, Brian, it's 1 minute and 1 second. We're going into the final countdown on man's flight to the moon. And it's just absolutely incredible here. The rocket is just raring to go. It's 50 seconds now until man takes off on this flight. And frankly, I just can hardly describe to you the excitement and the tension and the feeling of goosebumps that, well, this time we're really going, and it starts a whole new phase of man's life. Down to 31 seconds, 30 seconds. We've got so little time now before we finally take off. It'll lift off very slowly at first. Ignition will come at 8 seconds probably, and there are these big sort of brake things which will hold it down until we get to 0, and then it will take off very slowly. So slowly you think it's going to fall over. Now I'll give you the final countdown.
Righto, Darren, take it.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We have the ignition sequence. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, and the flames. You can see them now, and she's ready to go. It's starting to move, and if you can hear the noise, you can probably hardly hear me, but there she goes, and it's pulling away from the crowd. They're yelling, "Go, go, go, you beaut!" And now you'll hear the rumble. The stand that I'm sitting in is shaking. The lights in the stand are shaking, and there it goes. It's incredible. It's huge white flame. There's smoke all around this thing. I'll just let you listen for a second to the noise. The people are on their feet now saying, "Go, you beauty! Go!" And here it comes now, this roar. And we can still see it. It's gone into a very small patch of cloud. It's going to become clear again now. There we go. It's firing along. It's an absolute beauty. You can still hear that sound.
Thank you very much. My wife heard that tape recently for the first time, didn't recognise it, and said, "You sound like that bloke who, when the Hindenburg crashed and he recorded that one." That's what it sounded like. The tape, just quickly, the tape itself, I'd lost it. I didn't think I'd ever hear it again or see it again. But a PMG worker at Sydney heard it coming through from Cape Kennedy to 2GB, our main radio station, and thought this might be important one day. So he nicked a copy, he took the master tape and got a copy of it, and only late last year said to me, sent me an email saying, "Would you like it?" and sent it to me. So that's what we ended up with. Thanks very much for tonight, and thank you for inviting me, Peter. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Darren. It was really wonderful. You really get the sense of the excitement of the moment there. So we're just about finished. I'll just sort of finish off with a little bit of an update on some of the recently developing news stories relating to the moon. Here, sorry, could you just go back one? Sorry. Just for those who are interested, if you're out on one clear night looking up at the moon and you want to know where the 6 landers are currently, that's the places they are on the moon. 11, 12, 14, 13 didn't land, there's a famous movie about that, 15, 16 and 17. Now, this is going to put a big dent in the conspiracy theory people that thought there was a hoax in going to the moon. NASA recently launched an orbiting spacecraft called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, and it's not in its final orbit yet, so the highest resolution pictures won't be received for a little while, but they quickly put together some scans of the pictures from the early data of the landing sites, and these are those on the moon. You can see the arrows showing just the descent stage of the lunar module. They assure us that once the orbits are aligned and the scans are calibrated, that we should get resolution down to about 0.5 metre, so we should be able to see some quite clear detail. I'm going to finish off now. This is a quote that I particularly like. The people say, well, what was the moon landings all about? Why did we go to the moon? There's a lot of debate. There's a lot of interest in the fact that we went to the moon and we're going back. But one of the things that was really struck all of the astronauts, and I've met a couple of them myself, they say, looking back at the Earth, when you realise that the Earth is really a spacecraft in the middle of blackness, of nothing. And we, as people, human beings, are astronauts on that spacecraft. And there's no borders on the countries. The atmosphere, the habitable part of the planet, is a very, very thin film just clinging to the outside of that planet. And it really does give gravity to the fact that we need to look after the planet, and it's our home. So that's all we have for you. We're going to now go to the movie, The Right Stuff. I hope you enjoyed that, and once again I do appreciate Darren Hinch coming along and making his time available. I would like to make a special thanks to the Astor Theatre, who have been very gracious and helpful in letting us do this little presentation and putting it together, and Spacecraft Films, who've helped with the video, and also the Space Association of Australia. Thank you, and have a good night and enjoy the film. Just one quick